In the early years of the 22nd century, members of the Brotherhood of Steel, headquartered at the Lost Hills bunker in California, needed to travel across the country to Appalachia. Just 25 years after the bombs, they didn't have anything like the airship they would use centuries later to travel from Washington, D.C. to Boston. They would have to make this voyage on foot. We have a few details about this trip from Fallout 76, and with these details and some logical considerations, we can reconstruct a potential route for this transcontinental odyssey. I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is my version of the route taken by the Brotherhood's 1st Expeditionary Force. So this is the map of the route I believe they took. That said, let's get into how I constructed it. We'll start with specifics that we know from the lore. First, we have a starting point, an ending point, and a midpoint. They started from the Lost Hills bunker, they traveled to the Atlas Observatory, and they passed near Lincoln. Second, we know that they crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains. Third, we know they passed through a military site in the Midwest where they acquired an unknown number of Hellstorm missile launchers. Fourth, we know that those Hellstorm missile launchers were then taken from them in a fight with some raiders before they arrived in Appalachia. Fifth, we know that the expedition passed Lewis & Sons farm supply on their way into Appalachia. Let's extrapolate from those 5 items. On the first item about start, middle, and end points, we don't know the exact location of the Lost Hills bunker, but there is a small community outside Bakersfield, California called Lost Hills, and I used that as my starting point. As for the end point, the Atlas Observatory is of course fictional, but in game it is within sight of the very real Seneca Rocks, so I used that as my end point. I think that we can assume that Lincoln is Lincoln, Nebraska. There are a lot of Lincolns out there, but I think it's the one in Nebraska for one reason more than any other, which I'll detail when we get to it in the story. On the second thing we know for sure, as in how knowing that they crossed the Sierra Nevadas affects the route, this might not seem like a revelation. The Sierra Nevadas separate the interior of California from Nevada, but it does tell us that they went east over the mountains rather than south and then east around them. On the third point, when considering where they could have gotten the Hellstorm missile launchers, we have 2 criteria. It's a military site, and it's in the Midwest. I consulted a map of US military sites and found that there are a handful that could potentially fit the bill. The location I settled on was Rock Island Arsenal. This site, found on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River from Davenport, Iowa, was already on the route that I was considering, and it would be a likely spot to host such weaponry. On the fourth point, we know that the raiders that captured the Hellstorm launchers and carried them into Appalachia came in from Ohio. Lastly, the fact that they passed Lewis & Sons tells us that they entered the state from the southwest. Lewis & Sons is found on the Ohio River, south of Point Pleasant, and nearby to 2 locations with real-world analogs, Hillfolk Hot Dogs and Camden Park. In the real world, these are Hillbilly Hot Dogs and Camden Park, both found in the southwestern end of the state. With the directly extrapolated information covered, we must consider logical decisions about where to go on the route. They had to consider, among other things, pockets of radiation, raider hotspots, areas with a high feral ghoul population, and routes made impassable by bridge and tunnel collapses. With these problems in mind, we can assume that they would avoid 2 things. A. Large cities that would likely be more radioactive and filled with ghouls and raiders. And B. River crossings with only a single span crossing the river. One final note before we get started on the route. When I show you maps of the sections of the route, know that Google Maps has some hang-ups about providing walking routes through some sections of the map. For example, look at the driving route of the first day versus the walking route of the first day. The large jog in the route is there because Google doesn't want to provide a west-to-east walking route along this stretch of California 46 near Famoso. Attempting to force the route through these areas doesn't work. In these instances, I'll provide a driving version of the route. Okay, we've got the given lore, we've got the logical obstacles, let's get to it. At the start, the expedition was composed of Paladin Layla Romani, her second-in-command Knight Alan Connors, Knight Daniel Shin, Knight Matthew Thornberry, and Scribe Odessa Valdez. The party of 5 left Lost Hills behind at dawn and trekked generally eastward. By sunset, they'd crossed 35 miles of the San Joaquin Valley and reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The next morning, rather than head south towards the fairly radioactive Bakersfield, the home of Necropolis and Fallout 1, they continued east, heading up towards Isabella Lake. The Brotherhood had made trips into the Mojave before, so this was likely a route they'd taken in the past. Over the next 2 days, they hiked 48 miles, climbing up and then down as they crossed the first ridge of mountains. They didn't make as good time as they did in the first day, as their path forced them to climb over a mile into the sky before dropping them 2/3 as far into the valley beyond. These days, over a century before the birth of the new California Republic that would drain it, Isabella Lake remained full of the water of the Kern River. It was here on the banks of the lake in Wofford Heights that they found a band of raiders holding Brotherhood captives and carrying energy weapons. The expedition crushed these raiders and rescued their brethren, but found them too weak to travel alone. Knight Thornberry was selected to guide them back home across the mountain ridge. The expedition bid farewell to Knight Thornberry and his charges and returned to their route. They crossed the Kern River, either fording the river near Isabella Lake or crossing the Kern River Bridge in Kernville. They then followed the highway south and east, past the lake and on through the pass. In 2 days, they crossed the remaining 50 miles of the Sierra Nevada mountains. When they sat down to rest that 5th night, they had arrived in the desert. The next 7 days would be some of the most physically grueling of the entire trip. Their route would bring them through the almost completely uninhabited deserts of eastern California and southern Nevada. They passed through the land that would one day be known as the Divide, traveling by night and resting during the day in order to prevent heat stroke and to preserve their drinking water. In 7 days, they crossed 175 miles of some of the hottest, driest land on Earth, marching over 2 miles up and down as they went. As the sun began to rise on the 7th day, they were leaving California and passing into Nevada. Having passed through the worst of the desert, the expedition refilled their water at the springs of the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, and they rested through the night. The next day, they began their march again, starting a 4-day, 116-mile trek that would bring them past the ruins of Las Vegas. As they marched along the desert highway, they passed the forest-capped Charleston Peak to their south. Upon reaching the outskirts of Las Vegas, they turned east and passed the crumbling ruins to their north. While traveling on this stretch, they fended off the occasional attack of disorganized raider bands that held what remained of the city. In the penthouse atop the Lucky 38 casino, Robert House lay unconscious in his pod, his body slowly withering in an improperly mixed blend of pharmaceuticals. The expedition gave Nellis Air Force Base a wide berth to avoid the radioactive contamination that clung to the site 2 decades after the bombs. They followed Interstate 15 out of the valley and began to push to the northeast. Over the next 4 days, the expedition would cross 131 miles of 3 different states. They left Nevada behind, pushed through the northwestern corner of Arizona, and into southwestern Utah. Most of this terrain was more uninhabited desert, but they were likely small communities of wastelanders in the basins of the Muddy and Virgin Rivers. Upon reaching Utah, they came to the first large town since Vegas, St. George. Here, they chose to take a bypass around the city to its east, avoiding potential entanglements with raiders. After this, they continued up Interstate 15 as it followed the path of Ash Creek through the mountain gap that lay before them. Unbeknownst to the expedition, as they passed Zion National Park, they neared Randall Clark, a veteran and survivalist who had survived in the park since the war. Over the next 4 days, the expedition followed I-15 as it skirted the western edge of the Colorado Plateau. The scrub brush that had been their constant scenery in the preceding weeks was now interspersed with grasslands. They passed through the ruins of Cedar City, the largest town they would see for some time. The highway beyond had once been dotted with small farming and ranching communities, and it's likely that this paradigm was at least slightly maintained. They continued their northern route along the Long 15 until they reached the junction with I-70 and prepared to turn east once more. I-70 brought the expedition onto the Colorado Plateau. After a short hike up, they found themselves in a series of river valleys that fed the Colorado River to the south. While this land would one day fall to tribal warfare and the Legion, at the time it was likely home to a few small farming communities. After 3 days, they came out of the valleys and found themselves on the edge of a vast barren land that stretched as far as the eye could see. For 3 days, they traveled through 77 miles of beautiful but utterly desolate land. Here they didn't even find the ruins of settlements, for none had ever been built. They passed through a gap in a ridge and they found the San Rafael River. They crossed the river and arrived at the Green River a short time later. Here they rested and refilled their water supplies. Their path now led along the southern foothills of a mountain ridge. After another 4 days of walking, they arrived in Grand Junction, Colorado, where they met the western side of the Rocky Mountains. As they began their trek across the last great mountain ridge in their path, they were leaving the last desert of the trip behind. Their hike across the Rockies took 11 days and led them to climb nearly 4 miles and drop another 3 in that time. When they reached Idaho Springs west of Denver, they stopped to rest. Denver was unlikely to be a safe place. It was probable that the entire stretch from Denver south to Colorado Springs would have been hit hard in an attempt to wipe out any command capacity in NORAD. Therefore, the expedition turned north and spent the next 3 days hiking the local roads to Estes Park. In Estes Park, they rested, knowing they were spending their last night in the mountains. The path here again turned east. By noon, they were in the eastern foothills of the Rockies, and it was here that they lost radio contact with the Lost Hills bunker. After 7 weeks and nearly 1,300 miles, they were on their own. After 3 days marching, they reached Fort Morgan on the Platte River. It was here that they would rejoin the interstate highway system on their route east. For the next 13 days, they followed I-76 and I-80 as they traveled along the Platte, crossing the state of Nebraska. Though we don't know where most of the expedition's followers came from, I think it's safe to assume that most came from east of the Rockies, and we've now reached that point in their voyage. After covering 400 miles of Nebraska, the expedition reached the city of Lincoln. It was here that I-80 turned northeast and it moved towards Omaha. Omaha had always been an important part of the trip, as it held the key to crossing the next great physical barrier, the Missouri River. When they were planning the trip, they had no concept of the state of America's great waterways. Should the rivers be full, the expedition would absolutely require a functional river crossing, and Omaha had 9 of these before the war. The odds that they would all be out of service was lower than in a town with just 1 or 2. As an aside, this is why I came to the conclusion that Lincoln was Lincoln, Nebraska. Anyway, the expedition followed the highway as it brought them to Omaha and across the Missouri in 2 days. Once on the eastern side, they returned to I-80 and began the long trek across Iowa. It took 10 days to cross Iowa on I-80. They skirted around Des Moines and eventually reached Davenport and its 6 bridges over the Mississippi. Once across the river in Illinois, they explored the Rock Island Arsenal with its stockpile of Hellstorm missile launchers. With these dangerous weapons in hand and another great river crossed, the expedition turned south, following I-74. The highway turned east again in Galesburg 2 days later. Another 2 days after this, they reached Peoria and used one of its 8 bridges to cross the Illinois River. The next 2 weeks are my best guess as to where the Hellstorm took place. For those of you who didn't watch the lore video, this is my name for a disastrous battle the expedition participated in that went poorly for the Brotherhood. These 2 weeks saw them travel on I-74 into Indiana, past Indianapolis, and on to Cincinnati in Ohio, where they used one of its 8 bridges to cross the Ohio River. Having lost the Hellstorm launchers and Night Connors, the expedition continued. Now in Kentucky, they left the interstates behind and followed more direct local roads on their way southeast. 4 days hiking through Kentucky brought them to the Big Sandy River. They crossed one of Canova's 3 bridges over the river and were in West Virginia at last. 2 days of marching brought the expedition to the flooded ruins of Charleston. It was on this leg of the trip that they met the Putnam family at Lewis & Sons Farm Supply. In Charleston, they got onto Interstate 79, or 59 as it's known in the game. After a final 6-day march, the expedition arrived at the Atlas Observatory, where Russell Dorsey waited with vast quantities of donated supplies. Alright, I think that covers my conception of the voyage of the first expeditionary force. It appears to have been a journey approaching 2,900 miles and 107 days in length. You may note that this is a longer trip than I related in my lore video covering the expedition. This route I provided is a potential route, with many variations possible along its path, and the 2,800 mile estimate I provided in the lore video was of a slightly different variation. I do have a couple of notes before closing things out here. First, we have a couple of analogs here to examine when considering trips across America in an age without extant transportation infrastructure. The pioneers that traveled across the plains and the mountains to the west coast, and the experimental road trip across America taken by the United States Army in 1919. The pioneers took 4 to 5 months to cross the mostly untamed wilds of the western half of North America on their wagon trains. There were trails that were blazed, but these trails were in the middle of nowhere without real logistical support, and required fording river crossings and passing through territory of potentially hostile Native Americans. As for the experimental road trip, in 1919, a convoy of 81 Army vehicles crossed the continent on its patchy road network. It took 62 days. Dwight Eisenhower was one of the officers on this voyage, and it was one of the foundational experiences that convinced him of the necessity of the interstate highway system. Second, when the expedition exited the Sierra Nevada mountains, there were 2 possible paths they could have taken: north towards Death Valley, or south towards Barstow. Either passage seems possible, but I chose the north for 2 reasons. First, the northern route would be less populated, meaning there was a lower chance of an encounter with raiders. And second, I wanted them to have passed through the divide before it was destroyed in the run-up to Fallout New Vegas. Alright, I think that'll do it for my interpretation of the route taken by the Brotherhood 1st Expeditionary Force. If you want to receive notifications when I launch lore videos and videos like these, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.